Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamit in Highland Park, New Jersey, Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler at Solomon Check Day School, Long Island, and Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski in a room in Manhattan, New York City, TOCHECHA, but on sabbatical. We are talking about Parasha Behukotai. I would be remiss if I didn't say it was an amazing Parsha. It is an amazing Parsha. There's lots to talk about in this Parsha, and lots to talk about in the world. And we're going to get to both of those in this week's edition of Parasha Talk. But let's talk about the Parsha first. The Parsha, it's our last Parsha in the book of Vayikra. So from last Parshas, we would expect last things. We would expect kind of summary statements. And what we have occupying an entire chapter, a long, long chapter, is what we call this the TOCHECHA. The TOCHECHA is the rebuke, right? That's the word TOCHECHA means rebuke. It's also the rewards and punishments or the consequences and provisions of not following in the covenant. It starts out, Im behukotai telechu, if you follow my laws, v'im mitzvotai tishmeru, and if you observe my commandments, and then it says, v'natati gishmechem b'itam, I'm going to put the rains in its season, v'natna ha'aretz et yuvula, there's going to be abundance, a sense of God's munificence, God's beneficence, lots of blessing that will occur to you if you accept and keep the commandments. It's a beautiful picture. And then, of course, the opposite is true if you don't. It says in the turning moment, it's a kind of fulcrum for this. Vim lo tishma'u, if you don't listen, velo ta'asu, and you don't do them, and then v'im bechukotai tim'asu, if you despise, have contempt for my laws, v'im et mishpatai tik'al nafshechem, if you spurn them, if you reject them, if it makes you so, I mean, in modern Hebrew, goel nefesh is the sense of being nauseated by them, then these things are going to happen. And there are some rather terrible things. So the first question I want to ask is this a useful, how do we enter into this text? That's what I want to say, really. What do we think about this text? And how, what's its place here? Maybe you could talk about it, historically, in terms of the suzerain, sovereign, subject treaties, or homiletically. So give us your best shot here, Rabbi Barry Chesler.
Well, thank you. My best shot is this, that the Torah, we sometimes forget, is really an exquisitely beautiful text. So we're in the wilderness. We're reminded at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, and at the end, and in fact in the two endings, both at the end of chapter 26 and the end of chapter 27, which form part of our Parsha, that we're in the wilderness.
Yeah.
But the TOCHECHA is about the future. That the point of Sinai was not to revel in the revelation, as it were, but was to take this blueprint for life in the promised land and go there and live with promise. And we have a choice. We could do the right thing, or we could do the wrong thing. And one of the things I mention sometimes to my students is that the image of a path is sometimes an unexplored metaphor, because a path indicates that someone has already been there. That's what makes it a path. It's already been trodden. So that when we follow a path, we're going where someone else has gone. And when we were talking before the show, Elliot, I was struck by the way that you distinguish between the part about doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. We could go on the path that God has chosen, and behukotai telechu, or we could spurn it or condemn it, but it doesn't say not go on the path, because it's possible to act as if you are going on the path and do all the wrong things. And that is really the danger. The danger is not people that leave entirely, but people that think that they're on the path and actually are showing contempt. And that ends in disaster.
So you're on the path and you just hate being on the path.
Exactly. And and ultimately it becomes contempt for God. Now, historically, I think the way many of us understand this is that this is a vision, is put into Vayikra as a vision of what the future will be, but actually it's a retrospective. It's what actually happened.
Some things like this
People
happen.
lost the land because of all these things that Vayikra delineates. And in case you miss it here, we have another chance in Parshat Kitavo at the end of Sefer Devarim to get a richer version of all the things that could go wrong. But at the very end, God will remember the covenant, because our God, contrary to some popular opinion, is not a vengeful God, but a God of great hope, a God who keeps coming back to the people and says, you have messed up, but you can do better, and I can help you do better,
Jeremy,
and I want you to do better.
Give me, I don't know if you have a counter or a additional augmentation to that. That was very good, Barry.
Yeah, it was
Thank
very
you.
good. So I agree, especially on that last point about the hope. I mean, like the quantitative difference between the good stuff that's going to happen is a few verses, and then the bad stuff that's going to happen is a massive amount. So one could be forgiven for thinking that this is a total downer. But I do think that you're really onto something, Elliot, about the attitudinal things. It is about what you do, but it's also the attitude that you bring to it. And I do want to focus for a second on the beginning of the the good stuff that's going to happen, because I do think that religion back in Bible times, perhaps it made sense. Obviously, it made sense. We recorded it at this great length, and we keep reading it. To threaten punishment. I don't really think it works very well to threaten punishment at the moment. What I do think religion can do is hold up a vision for what the world might be. And just before all the bad stuff that happens, it says in chapter 26, take off my glasses so I can see, verse 12, it says, "V'hitalachti b'tochechem, and I will walk in your midst, v'hayiti lachem Elohim, and I'll be your God, v'atem tihiyu li la'am, and you'll become my people. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I'm the Lord your God, asher hotzeti etchem meretz Mitzrayim, took you out of Egypt, mihiyot lahem avadim, from being their servants. Va'eshbor motot ulchem, I'll break the yokes on your shoulders, va'olech etchem kol memiyut, and I will lead you kol memiyut." Now, kol memiyut, by the way, is the only time it appears in the whole Tanakh. It's called hapax. So this is the one time, but it's on our daily liturgy. V'tolichenu kol memiyut le'artzenu. You lead us. You lead us. It means upright. Kol memiyut probably means like double tall.
Like Simon Greenberg, upright.
Koma v'koma, like double tall. And I will give you dignity, and I will give you pride, and I will give you self-assurance. And there's a certain kind of attitude that you can come to this religion with that kind of attitude, that kind of, I think about it like just a small practice that our listeners either know about or might want to know about. In the Amidah, when you bow, you're supposed to say Baruch Atah, and you bow down and stand up at Adonai, because at the word Adonai you stand up, because Adonai zokef kifufim, the Lord straightens up the bent. But in this context, it means like the contact with Hashem should make you kol memiyut. The contact with Hashem should give you that dignity and strength and full-floweredness of a person. And so I think about this parasha. Before we get to the negative stuff, I think about the positive stuff, holding out a vision of how you might live as a really fully realized, developed human being at one with all your capabilities.
I'm remembering Rabbi Simon Greenberg, Zichrono Livracha, who was he always stood upright, and he was always critical if you kind of were slouched over, and he always, was admonishing all of us to stand up straight. So I want to propose this theory about the TOCHECHA, okay? And Jeremy, I think I'm gonna relate it to something that you said in a different context about love and loss, and the intensity that a person experiences in loss, which is directly proportional to their relationship with the person. In other words, the pain that you experience when you lose a loved one is in relationship to the quantity of love. You said it in much more eloquent terms, right? So I want to propose that the reaction that God has here in the TOCHECHA that goes on for many tens of verses is a direct manifestation of that, the feeling of betrayal, the feeling of intense need for the people. That God, I'm going to frame this in terms of the quest for that intimacy with the people, and the severe disappointment that God will experience. That if you turn away, if you spurn, and it's the contempt, it's the reaction, God's reaction to being held in contempt, and to being when people are disgusted with God. It's that intense. And so it's almost, I said in my class this week, I want to put God on the couch. There's some therapy that needs to happen here. God has such a strong reaction, but that strong reaction is directly quantitatively related to his love for Israel. And I'm asking you to react to that because it's based on something that you said in a different context of loss. I don't know if you would concur.
You have to, I mean, I want to say something a little bit controversial, perhaps. I mean, there's a pattern. We see this in, here we are, Behukotai. We're going to have this in the Haftarah next week in Bamidbar. From Hosea is like, I love you so much that I have to hurt you. And there's a way in which this is kind of, it raises for me, I mean, I get the emotional quality, and I'm concerned about an image of punishment out of control. Like, I do think that the get God on the couch thing is very relevant. What I said about Koma Miut is that I think that God wants to impart dignity. The TOCHECHA kind of looks like God wants to crush dignity. And so the great love is like, this is everything in the Tanakh. This is God's great love for the people. But God also has to, I mean, in real religion, we tell a story. We told the story for many hundreds of years. But I also am concerned about telling a story in which divine rage gets out of control and goes off the chain. By the way, you should say the thing you said about the psychologist John Gottman, who, by the way, is an observant Jew.
Yes, yeah. So John Gottman says that one of the great predictors of the dissolution of relationship and the dissolution of marriage is contempt. And so he says that, and this is quoted and there are lots of websites and lots of videos on YouTube with him saying this, but it was most prominently quoted in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, which came out over a dozen years ago, and he talks about the single most prominent indicator of marital dissolution, which is contempt of one party to the other. And in here I'm reading this text in terms of, well, if that's what God is anticipating, why wouldn't you expect God to react completely off the wall? And in other words, it's the intensity of the a relationship. It's the intensity of the quest for intimacy with the people of Israel that has made God so vulnerable. And here I'm going to read it with, charitable to God. And we're trying to do the therapy, which is, you really feel this way because you really love this people, because you really love this people, because you need this people, because you need to be in the world, and the entire existence of the universe depends on your being in the world. So everything is ultimate here, and therefore the ultimate is being stated here. Even though I'm going to say this as from the folk tradition, we read this quietly. We read it we don't want it to be true. We frame this text in an undertone. We want to soften and cushion the vitriol of it, because we can't believe that God would do this, even though we've experienced this and worse over the course of Jewish history. It elicits from us pain. Pain, heart-wrenching moment of Torah, in that category. It's painful.
So I want to suggest a slightly different reading here. I think the failure of the TOCHECHA is not in the litany of curses. It's the failure of the blessings to match them. And what speaks to me is that this is a human response, not a divine response. That in our lives as we live them, we have a much harder time quantifying the good than we do quantifying the bad. When something goes wrong, we have a tendency to list every single detail. When something goes right, we shrug our shoulders. Yeah, I deserve that. And as you know, there's the rabbinic dictum, "Chayav adam levarech mea brachot kol yom." You have an obligation to say 100 blessings every day. And as the way rabbis are, there's a list of them in the Shulchan Aruch that you could consult if you want to know how to do it. But the point is that we have to learn how to recognize the blessings in our life. And in the TOCHECHA, we understand the anger here, but part of the anger, I think, is our own failure to be able to recognize the good in a more meaningful way than a few verses that are kind of thrown off. And that suggests to me that maybe the authorship here is more human than divine, and that the discomfort that you feel with the TOCHECHA is better directed to our ancestors and to us, because we sin in the same way that they do in the image of our tradition, than perhaps to God.
Well, I think that's a very useful approach, and I think that kind of takes, for the community of our congregations and of course the people that are joining in and watching and listening to us, who are really invested in understanding and reading and learning and enjoying the text. I think that's very useful. I think it's useful to kind of say, there are certain parts of the Torah that are difficult, that are complicated, that we have to read in different contexts, that we have to really kind of examine on the most granular detail and take out from these texts exactly a message like you're saying, which is it's not only count your blessings, but understand where the focus is and where the focus of your life is. I think that's very, very powerful. So we're going to segue into the second part of the Parsha, and the second part of the Parsha is almost like an encore. It's almost like an addendum. It does truly feel like an appendix to the book of Vayikra, simply because the book of the chapter that we just read ends with a verse that says, "These are the laws and rules and instructions that the Lord established with Moses on Mount Sinai. And you would expect, at that point, Hazak Hazak Venithazek, that we all stand and say, congratulate ourselves for reading another book of the Torah. Except there's another movement, there's another chapter, and the chapter deals with Nidarim, the vows, the votive offerings to the temple. So can we talk for a second about this and its place here, and the direction that we want to go in, of course, is how do we value a human life? And of course, as we talk about this, we're thinking of precious lives that were cut down in both in Buffalo last week and in Texas this week. It's almost as if we approach this as a tremendum, that there's on the one hand nothing to say, but there's so much to say, and there's so much to react to, and there's so much to think about, because here in this text we have a quantification of the value of a human life in a very, very specific context. And of course we know that every life is precious and infinite. So how do we relate to this text, and what is this text trying to say? And I don't know if you want to try to step into this. Jeremy, I'm going to go to you here.
Let me just, I'm going to guess that maybe our many listeners aren't exactly up on what this whole votive offerings thing is. So
Yes.
in temple times and in biblical times, people made gifts to the sanctuary. They might make a gift of an animal or a piece of property. They might make a gift of themselves. I hereby dedicate my own life or value to the temple, to the sacred place. And they might, in a vestigial way, we know that that at some early date, all the firstborns were supposed to work in the temple, and then in the book of Bamidbar, they're going to get replaced by the Levite clan, and there's going to be an economic, redemption for the firstborns. So there are any number of circumstances under which people might say, I hereby pledge my own life to the temple, which then did not mean, probably at some point in history, it meant that they went and worked in the temple the rest of their lives. But at some later point, I said, I hereby pledge myself to the temple. It didn't mean that they left their families and went to the temple. It meant that they paid an economic amount for their life. And it's kind of weird because we are raised, we as contemporary Jews or whatever, we're raised on the idea of the infinite value of life. And it is. That's fundamental to the whole concept of being created in the image of God. Life is infinitely valuable. You can't put a price on it. This is why, the Bible, frankly, is so you spoke about Simon Greenberg. I'll say a word in his son's name. Moshe Greenberg wrote a famous essay with the poetic title of Some Postulates on Biblical Criminal Law. I mean, doesn't that title just make you want to read Some Postulates on Biblical Criminal? But he said, listen, the reason the Bible is so insistent on the death penalty for murder is because human life is infinite, and you can't pay it off. The Bible insists you can't just pay a debt, as Hammurabi would allow you to pay a dollar figure. Bible doesn't let you do that because it's infinite life. So if it's infinite life, what's up with these evaluations? I in fact asked that question to Moshe Greenberg directly when I was studying in his class many years ago.
Wow.
And he explained that it's not really an evaluation. It's putting a dollar figure on the economic contribution that a person would make. And so this is why, when we have a vestige of this in the Pidyon Haben, that the firstborn child sort of belongs to the temple and has to be paid off for 5 shekels or something like that. Not like that, exactly that. Even still nowadays, but it's weird because it doesn't sit with us with the idea of the infinite value of life, and we can think of any number of ways, even in our time, when courts and legal stuff, you do end up placing a value. It doesn't mean, I think it was like 2.7 million is the number that jumps to my mind about the victims of 9/11 or something. It doesn't mean that their life was $2.7 million. It means that the federal government paid that amount. Their life was worth more, but you had to come to a dollar figure, and they came to a dollar figure. And so there's something like that going on here. It's like really a present thing in our minds because in America today, we're talking about the day after the Texas shootings, and you'll feel just the infinite value of all of these precious little children's lives, and the Torah says something about how you arrive at a dollar figure, but right now I really feel there's a gap between that practical thing and the theoretical thing of what's really infinite.
Is there a way that we could spring from that kind of discussion? The Torah is really, 50 shekels for a man, 20 to 60 to how do we think about what happened? How do we process this as, in a country that is very shaken, I guess, but also divided, and not terribly sure exactly how to proceed on these questions. Is there something that we can provide here?
So I would add 2 things to our discussion. I think the first thing is to recognize what chapter 27 is doing here in terms of the scope of the book of Vayikra, which takes up a great deal with the subject of sacrifices, what people bring to God. But chapter 27 comes to remind us that what God really wants is not what you bring, but he wants you. And that's why you put a monetary value on yourself, because you are the one who is being transferred to the Beit HaMikdash, or in the case of the Tanakh, the Torah, the Mishkan, because that's what God demands. After everything has been said about sacrifices and the priestly service, God wants you. And as you were speaking, Elliot, I was reminded of the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, I think in the name of Rabbi Meir, that when a criminal is put to death, the divine present holds its head and weeps. And I think that's the feeling that we have today in a world where God's divine image has been diminished, reduced by the victims in Texas, and God himself, in the image of Rabbi Meir, is crying because even God does not know what to do. But I think what we can do is look for a way to restore the value of a human life. We live in a society that has been coarsened for any number of reasons. The fact that for the last 2 years, we've been in various stages of quarantine, of shut-in because of COVID. We need to be able to look in the mirror, look at ourselves, and look at other people, especially those with whom we're not inclined to agree, as bearers of the divine image. We won't prevent tragedies because we can't do that. But what we can do is promote a greater appreciation for the value of a human life.
Does that include also talking about evil and talking about and like, can you imagine? I mean, I do imagine getting up and saying, lo tirtzach. I mean, can we hear that voice again that says lo tirtzach? It's and I'm not saying forget about guns and forget about all that. These are huge, complicated legal, political problems that none of us, no single person can even approach. But
I would just add that the danger is not talking enough. The danger is not from talking too much. Is that we have a tendency, I think it's rooted in our national fabric, to look for simple solutions, slogans. There are no simple solutions here. There is no slogan that can provide a veneer for what has happened, but it requires that we address the issue in all of its complexity and not say that it's too much for us.
So, and the issue has its legal, political, constitutional components, but also has its moral components, because we're in a society, as you said, that we are in the specific moment of 2 years of isolation. I would add that we need to look at the role of technology and devices in terms of the way it removes us from actual human contact with each other, notwithstanding the fact that mass murder events have taken place before computers and social networking, but the moral guardrails of our society that were invisible, they're not as strong anymore. People don't have trust in institutions. That synagogues and churches are not necessarily bursting at the seams for people hungry for the word of God. They're not, and they're getting whatever they need spiritually from whatever else. You can look at lots of indicators of this and think, is our society grounded in a way that would enable it to heal or protect itself or guard against future occurrences of this kind of violence?
I think this is, there are so many, as you said, there's the tendency to look for simple solutions is going to not be helpful. I'm going to guess that most of the people who we talk to think that nothing bad can happen by reducing the number of guns out there.
Sure.
That mental illness, the violence, people may have predispositions to do terrible things, and if they don't have assault rifles, they'll do fewer terrible things, right? They just, the capacity for wreaking havoc is just much worse if they can get their hands on machine guns. But that's probably not the entirety of the answer either, because like any public policy questions, I think that they're like at least fair questions about what will be effective, and just a stroke of a pen is not necessarily going to solve every problem. I do want to say that that of course religions ought to be successful. I hope we are successful at cultivating people's sense of the infinite value of life, and the preciousness of life, and the inviolability of you just simply cannot take a life. And I do think that is a moral question and not a psychiatric question. And I clearly think that there's like some psychiatric stuff going on there too, that people are not that I want to lighten the burden of the moral burden of respecting the inviolability of life, but I also think that people are just manifestly unstable as well, and I don't know how to handle this. I don't know anything about this individual. The Buffalo case is obviously so wrapped up with the particular psychosis in this country right now about hating the other, and that is a whatever, again, psychiatric elements are in that, and there certainly are some. That is fundamentally a moral question, and we have to whatever extent we can, advance. This is the religious claim that every human life is B'Tselem Elohim, and manifests the image of God. And if we don't have success in waving that flag, then we got bigger.
So I've been fond of saying, and this, and we're approaching the end of our conversation. I've been fond of saying that Torah, the study of Torah, actually teaches us how to share and disagree and differ and respect and create community and bond with each other, and that in the country, while there are so many different opinions and positions on these matters, there doesn't seem to be a way of respectful dialogue on principles for them, and shared things. I was looking at this, and in my own kind of way of thinking about this, I wonder, there's a national day of mourning for victims of murder. It doesn't say it's not a victims of gun violence. It's a national day of mourning for homicide victims, and nobody knows about this. I googled it. Is there a national day of mourning? And there is. It's September 25th, and I thought, could that be a day that everybody puts aside, their differences on the politics of this, and says, what we have is the tragic loss of human life, and as both of you said in so eloquent ways, a loss of a life is a loss of an infinite world, and it's a diminishment of God's presence in the world, and can we at least agree on that as a starting point for something, and that. If we use the modality of study as an example where we can disagree on things and we can still love each other and create a community of learning and create a respect around each other, is there some source of hope for us? Is it?
Can I just tell you one thing, by the way, one good thing about that last point that you made about study and disagreement? Today, this morning, I love doing this more than it's my favorite things to do. They used to do it all the time before the pandemic, and now it's much less. But groups of Israelis come to learn about through the UJ Federation or other organizations. I did one a few weeks ago with Tali educators, and today I did one with local government officials from all. People did a bunch of different jobs. Some were local government officials, some were other people in civic life. They come to learn about it. There was Palestinian Israeli citizen who was a part of the group today. Anyway, I was talking with a Haredi guy from Gilo, very interesting guy. It was an Orthodox rabbi, a Reform rabbi, and myself on the panel. And there's a Haredi guy who said, we need to have more panels like this in Israel. We need to, it's so sad to me that we don't have differing views on a panel together to talk. We can disagree. I still oppose what you stand for, but we need to have more. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This is fabulous. This is exactly what we need.
Yes, very good.
So what I would add, Elliot, in light of our discussion of infinite value, is that as rabbis, we believe, and as Jews, we believe that the Torah also has an infinite value. And I think that what we sometimes need to remember is that the infinite value of the Torah is not to exist in and of itself, but to create and to increase our sense of humanity.
Yeah.
It's something that we can do to make ourselves better human beings. And that, I think, is always a good thing.
Hazak Hazak Venithazek. That's a great way to end this conversation, a great way to end the book of Vayikra, which was an amazing book, complicated book, but stuff that gave us a lot to think about. So I want to thank our viewers and listeners for being with us on a more challenging Parsha this week, but we look forward to being with you again on the next edition of Parasha Talk. Everyone, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.